What is the scariest object in a D&D world? The thing that parents the world over will warn their children about? The centre of cautionary tales throughout history? Well, you've seen the title. I believe that one of the most ominous things in any D&D world is not a ghost, a vampire, or that creeping mould on your wall, but a statue. And I believe it for good reason. Firstly, I do need to point out that when we're designing our ancient temples and underground complexes, we're operating on some very strange assumptions. I want you to think back to the last game you played that had statues in it. They looked like people, right? Similar properties to things they represent. Yes, they may have been broken, battered, or weathered slightly, but they were attempts to physically create the actual features of a creature. Well, this is a very European assumption. It comes to us from our aesthetic view of ancient Greece and ancient Rome, brought to us by the Renaissance. The truth is, really, for most cultures and much of history, statuary was not a realism-based art. It was representative. It was intended to represent the characteristics of a figure, not be a one-to-one recreation of life. Especially the practice of depicting gods, deities, and spirits using realistic sculpture is quite a Greco-Roman ancient Hellenistic practice, which is significantly unusual in the rest of the world. I mean, many religions choose not to depict their gods physically at all. Your mind might immediately jump to one of the more common faiths that make statues of deities, Hinduism. But even Hindu statues of gods are not supposed to be physically representative in a realism sense. They are figurative representations that make great use of symbology, colour theory, and objects that have certain extended meanings. They are objects of worship to guide worship through a potential discussion of wisdom, the stillness of water, and all of these things encapsulated within a statue. It is more about the figurative symbolic language of hand positions, objects being held, and the relationality between all of that guides the eye, guides the meditation, guides the thought process, more so than a specific depiction of how a deity should look. The earliest statues in human history are figurative, non-literal descriptions of the human figure and non-human figures, indeed. And so why is our default assumption of statuary, when we observe it in our games, in our fantasy worlds, that it is in some way an attempt to capture a realistic likeness? Why does all this matter? Well, in my opinion, in D&D styled worlds, attempting to create a realistic statue, a perfectly realistic statue on the level of the Renaissance greats, would be perhaps the ultimate taboo. Speaking of Dungeons & Dragons specifically, the statue is perhaps the object with the most potential monstrous disguises and variations that could be hiding behind it. Stone golems, stone cursed, homunculi, animated armours, gargoyles, mimics, stone giant dreamers, eidolons in sacred statues, and that's without getting into the numerous adventures that have animated statues as some part of their specific monster bestiary. Ghosts of Saltmarsh has 3, Out of the Abyss and Dungeon of the Mad Mage have 2 apiece. Dragon Heist, Storm King's Thunder, and Tales from the Yawning Portal, as well as arguably Wild Beyond the Witchlight, have 1 each as well. Statues that are so lifelike you could swear they've just moved. Oh wait, are literally basically their own genre of monster at this point. So the question really is, what kind of an insane society is going to value accurate, painstaking realism in statuary when some of those statues are literally just living creatures disguising themselves as statues? Why would you have a beautifully realistically rendered statue of someone when that statue, being beautifully realistically rendered, is more likely to be something that is designed to mimic a statue and try and kill you? And we haven't even got to the worst offender in the incredibly lifelike statue that seems like it could move at any moment genre of monster. In the monsters that can create such pieces of art through paralyzing people and transfiguring them, petrifying them into stone. A beholder, a basilisk, a cockatrice, a Medusa, or a Gorgon, all have the capacity to do this to unwary wanderers or hapless victims. They can turn flesh into stone. Some temporarily, some forever. Even a 6th level spell is capable of this very effect, and it doesn't make it less taboo to have specific lifelike realistic statues knocking about when they could be pretty corpses created by a monster or early warning signs of some horrific monster's presence in your area. So an incredibly realistic statue is either a depiction of a god or goddess, which is oftentimes a taboo thing to attempt, or it is just a person who died hundreds of years ago, frozen in time by some petrifying monster, or it's some hyper-realistic attempt to look like stone for a creature that certainly isn't stone and is going to try and rip your face off in the next few moments. It's honestly a pretty horrible idea to have realistic-looking statues anywhere near where people are. Given all this, I can imagine D&D societies having clear rules against realistic statues, or even statues in general. The problem is, though, that humans, and most likely our fantasy counterparts, have been making representational statues of things around us, objects, people, creatures, for longer than we've had agriculture, the wheel, or money. Maybe even 4 times longer than all of those. As I mentioned earlier, though, the earliest 2 statues existing in our archaeological record are not in any way realistic. One depicts a freakishly tall individual with the head of what seems to be a lion, a bipedal lion man, which is very interesting, that being the first statue object that we have in the record of humanity. And the first one that seems to have been a representation of the human figure is a rather plump depiction of a voluptuous woman who archaeologists are very quick to refer to as fertility idols. That is kind of the blanket term for any figure of certain voluptuousness. So let's take this concept of statues, in especially realistic ones, being taboo a little further. First, it is very unlikely that any realistic attempt is going to be made to carve a statue of a deity, considering these deities are active in the world quite often, and can smite you if you get it wrong or make a particularly ugly likeness. It's a high stakes thing, especially because idols can just become vessels for the god to put their power into, and therefore they can watch you at all times, which is not potentially ideal in especially some of the more vindictive categorizations of deity. It is likely then that symbology becomes far more useful in sculpture even than it is in our sculptural history, meaning that you can represent a person, an idea, or a concept using simple shape symbols, potentially. A sphere, for example, as a simple statue itself, could represent wholeness, with certain scorings, markings on it, giving some sort of biographical account of a person's life set in stone, but not as a visual representation of the person, more as a record of their deeds, perhaps. It is also possible that non-full body statues may become more common. The bust, for example. It is shoulders and above, usually. It is a visual representation of a person, and I would not expect a bust to be quite as capable as an entire full-body statue of, chasing you around and doing any significant harm. I suppose it can still bite you, In that sense, I suppose if we are still using realistic statues, it is possible that they might even be restrained in some way. There is a Greek tradition which is best exemplified in the caryatid statues on the Acropolis, which is the kind of tradition of placing statues as parts of columns, holding up structures themselves, using an excellent artistic practice to carve out a column that is also a statue, which is quite the impressive feat. It has the added bonus of trapping whatever creature is inside in holding up an entire building, which means that if it starts moving, it's not long for this world anyway, so you don't really have to worry. Equally, statues may be built to literally physically hold up a structure to demonstrate their strength, perhaps holding up ceilings in a literal and perhaps metaphorical way, like statues of Atlas more traditionally, except interior to buildings, meaning that, again, if they move, if they end up being living statues, well, they'll just crush themselves before they can wreak havoc in a city. It is also possible that statues may be physically restrained by manacles, even to their platforms, or realistic statues, if we're forced to make them, or if they are a specific feature of the aesthetic beauty of the culture that they are within, may instead be dangled or hung from high bridges or grand structures by chains, allowing them to, even in the worst case, if they do animate, not really get anywhere of any significance. But back to abstract representation for a moment, it's not just realistic statues that can move, as I'm sure some of you have been shouting at the screen or typing in the comments already. Golems, for example, are famously misshapen or loosely shapen lumps of stuff. Even stone golems are not depicted as objects of art, and they are quite significantly taller and more buff in most art than your average, Michelangelo's David, for example. So it might not be enough to just make a statue that doesn't really look like a person, to convince the people of a world that it's not some sort of threat to them. Perhaps we go back to that abstract representative concept of the simple shape in a symbolic shape language. Perhaps that sphere from earlier is all that it takes to represent a deity, perhaps a sphere with a stucco girdle around it and a few score marks, 7 specifically, to represent the god's 7 great deeds in life. Perhaps script is used to denote what is being represented, to give a name to the piece or the creature that is being represented by this shape language, and each strike of a craftsman's chisel has a different meaning, a different shared understanding among the community that gives tale to a grand series of battles, a grand set of aesthetic features, and all of this. It could work, but I will say that generally, as vain-glorious individuals, those in power do quite like to see their face on things. And if they have a nice body, they like to see that too. Relief sculpture may be a safer way to go than a freestanding sculpture, seeing as that has still 3-dimensional elements and an effort to capture a likeness, but the likeness is indeed trapped within a larger piece of material. But it is also possible to find a compromise between representative and realistic style sculpture, where we still get likenesses that feel like the individuals being represented, but they're not likely to use their physical forms to go off and chase people down and kill them. The artistic forms of caricature and cartooning might actually provide us with the inspiration we need here. Despite common perception, caricature is not a wholly negative or critical form. It is intended to highlight specific striking features of a person. Those can indeed be positive aspects highlighted by caricature as well. It is possible then that a sort of mastery level develops, not in realistically depicting the human form, but in capturing an essence of a person, using caricature to highlight certain features, creating an object of art that is entirely divorced from the physical body and yet representative fully of it, recognizable even. Master sculptors may be prided on the thinness of the necks that they achieve, or the cinched waists, or the thin wrists leading on to the great hands that are holding objects, their ability to render seemingly unreal forms that would twist and snap at a moment's movement, that yet stand still as a single statue. Perhaps sculptors have mastered the form of using the, cartoonish proportions or the caricature proportions to make these gigantic heads stand atop spindly pencil necks and yet not collapse in the form of the statue that is being made. Certain poses to allow the stone to hold together even. This is because these small, thin points, these joints that are unrealistically small, unable to hold up a person really if they were in full movement, if they turn they would crack in half. That's almost the point. The more spindly some elements of this can be, the more impressive it is that it still stands. And the safer the citizenry can sleep at night, because if this statue suddenly started moving, every piece of it would break into dozens. It might seem strange to have an entire civilization's art style formed out of misproportioned caricatures of their leaders. But honestly, given all this logic, given the ability that if these statues ever were to move, they would snap into pieces and therefore cause no threat to anyone, as well as, actually capturing an essence of a person quite well, or at least what the artist wants to show about the person, there's actually some serious merit to this idea in a D&D civilization. We've all heard about Barbie's impossible, tiny cinched waist that if she turned too fast, she'd snap in half. Well, Barbie is often regarded as idealized form of womanhood, at least in the aspirations of young girls. But that's rather the point. If these caricatures of the great heroes were to turn too fast, yes, they snap in half, and yes, they keep people safe by doing it, because they should not turn. Barbie should not move in a three-dimensional space except by the careful hand of the artist of play. As much, these sculptors should not be moving in any way, because that means that something's gone rather horribly wrong. Precariousness may indeed perhaps be the most prized artistic height of them all. But this only really works in places that aren't very tectonically active, which is certainly not everywhere. If you build your spindly statues that could fall at a moment's notice, well, if you have even the most minor of earthquakes, then there is an immediate and fairly obvious problem to that. In that case, we might see other forms of statuary take precedence, rather than the grand statues in grand palaces and halls and public parks. Instead, we could see forms like the Japanese dogu taking precedence, these smaller clay constructions from prehistoric Japan that are smaller usually than a forearm. Small, again, misproportioned little creatures, little guys, who are significantly less threatening generally than a giant 20-foot tall statue of some long-forgotten god might be if it decides to go rogue. These dogu are unlikely to be, placed on grand pedestals in the middle of town squares, but rather kept as personal tokens and vestiges and idols inside the home. And it's a lot less threatening to see a tiny little homunculus running towards you intending to, bite your ankle, than, especially if it's made of clay that can be smashed and dashed against a wall, than, that gigantic monster in the town square. Another potential solution is taking the bust concept from earlier, what's it going to do, bite you, and expanding that. Literally. The folks over on Easter Island made some pretty famous heads. They are grand displays of public art, public statuary. They're not brought into the home and used as tiny little idols that are non-threatening, but they are simply heads. They are likenesses, they are impressive, they are absolutely representations of the human form, or perhaps even the divine form, but because of their truncated nature as creatures, not potentially quite as threatening, and so could work under our D&D paradigm of wanting something that can't chase you. Add to that the fact that they're sturdy enough to survive and they're not going to topple or break in a minor earthquake. Indeed, public statuary, public art may just not be a massive thing in tectonically active or in other regions, considering these considerations. It's very plausible that there's really no point in creating statues per se, things with arms and legs that could be animated, could move, in any ancient temple, in any space really, because it's just asking for trouble. Perhaps these representational spheres are really all that we need. But there you have it. Statues that depict people, deities, and creatures may be vanishingly rare in D&D worlds. And it turns out our own world's history is littered with numerous examples of how to do non-realistic statues well, and in interesting fashions. So next time you find yourself inside or planning an underground temple with statues inside it to deity and creature alike, ask yourself if this is a statue of a creature, or instead a statue of an idea. Thank you for indulging me. I might have some unfortunate scheduling situations going on over the next couple of weeks, so we might not see proper regular videos on Mondays as I have been doing so far. Things are unfortunately getting a little hectic, and I will be back. I enjoy making these videos far too much, I promise you. But with all that said, I've been Tom, otherwise known as the Grungeon Master. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video.